everybody. Welcome to another ghost story. I am going to be reading for you today a classic from Sheridan Le Fanu, however Frenchly you want to pronounce it. He was a 19th century Irish writer who contributed quite a bit to the sort of gothic horror macabre genre. He's probably most well known for writing Carmilla. It's one of the early famous vampire stories. This one's significant because the two characters, both the victim and the vampire, are actually female. So it's a really good story. It's a short story. It's not a huge long novel. So if you've never read it, I would recommend it. It's quite a good one. What I'm going to be reading today is not Carmilla, although in the future I suppose that's a possibility. I'm going to be reading Green Tea, which is a short story from one of his collections called In a Glass Darkly, published in 1872. Got a bunch of short stories in the collection. They're sort of all tied together and presented as the papers of this doctor who you will meet in our reading today. I hope you've all noticed the new spooky background. I hope it adds to the ambiance here a little bit. Now, a note on our text today. It is a short story, but it's a long one. There are 10 chapters plus a prologue and an epilogue, a conclusion. It's not a novel, but it is longer than what I would typically read. So I am going to have to break it up into two videos just because otherwise it's going to be like obnoxiously long. Nobody's going to want to sit through it. So today I think we will probably do the prologue through to about maybe the end of chapter 6. And then the rest of it will be in another video. So going to give the usual caution that this is a Victorian ghost story, and as such, there may be some things in the text, some things that are expressed that have to do with, some pretty unpleasant Victorian views on things like gender, race, sexuality, mental health, religion, all the usual cautions. Um, I don't know if there's a ton of that in this one. It's been a while since I've read it, but it is something to bear in mind. Also, this is going to be the usual format. I'm reading and commenting on the text. So if that's not something you're interested in, if you want to just straight up have the story told to you, there's other people that do that. And of course, you're free to pick up the story yourself. It's in a lot of places. It is free online. There's also a number of books that have it um, in the collection, so it's not difficult to find. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. And after I have some water, I will get started on the story. There we go, all set. And as usual, I do apologize in advance for any misspeaking, any word stumbling. This story might have some Latin in it, and I apologize in advance for butchering that as well. So that's enough preamble from me, I think, and we are going to start with Green Tea, the prologue. So here we go. I hope you all enjoy. So, prologue. Martin Hesselius, the German physician. Though carefully educated in medicine and surgery, I have never practiced either. The study of each continues, nevertheless, to interest me profoundly. Neither idleness nor caprice caused my cessation from the honorable calling which I had just entered. The cause was a very trifling scratch inflicted by a dissecting knife. The trifle cost me the loss of 2 fingers, amputated promptly, and the more painful loss of my health, for I have never quite been well since, and have seldom been 12 months together in the same place. So that is terrifying. And I want to say that actually did happen in the Victorian era, because of course amputations were often relying on speed because you might have limitations because of the anesthetics of the day that people are still trying to figure out. It's easy to give people the wrong dose, and of course, there's a question of payment as well. So speed was a doctor's friend, but and a patient's friend for that matter. But let's just say there are some occasions where you should maybe focus on going carefully as opposed to going quickly. There was a time Dr. Lister, actually, who's a very important figure in Victorian medicine. I urge you to seek out information about him if that interests you. Um, he he had he didn't have it, he performed an operation, and the result of that operation was a 300% fatality rate. And how did that happen, you may ask? Well, he was amputating, I believe, a leg, and again, maybe focused a little more on the quick as opposed to the accurate, because he amputated the man's leg. The man died. He nicked his assistant. I don't remember if it was like a full, like he took off some fingers or anything, but the assistant died from the resulting wounds and infections. And a spectator, because that was also a thing you could do in the Victorian era, um, had a heart attack. The official report, I think, was that he died of fright from this grisly scene. So one operation killed three people, two of whom you wouldn't you would sort of assume would have been perfectly safe. You would assume that the danger was only to the patient. Another time, Lister, again, I believe it was a leg amputation, and he was going a little bit quick, took off the man's leg and also a testicle. So that was a thing that happened. So when our narrator here is saying that, he barely had time to get any actual practice in his profession before this accident use of cost him his fingers and his health. That's not an exaggeration. This guy could have come out way worse in that kind of accident. So yeah, there's a really good book actually called The Butchering Art about the history of Victorian surgery and the development of hygiene and disinfecting and all that. You should read it. It's a good book. So sorry for that rather prolonged interlude, but yeah, Victorian surgery, incredibly dangerous. So he's had this amputation, he's not been well, and here we go back into the text. In my wanderings, I became acquainted with Dr. Martin Hesselius, a wanderer like myself, like me a physician, and like me an enthusiast in his profession. Unlike me in this, that his wanderings were voluntary, and he a man, if not fortune, as we estimate fortune in England, at least in what our forefathers used to term easy circumstances. He was an old man when I first saw him, nearly 35 years my senior. In Dr. Martin Hesselius I found my master. His knowledge was immense, his grasp of a case was an intuition. He was the very man to inspire a young enthusiast like me with awe and delight. My admiration has stood the test of time and survived the separation of death. I am sure it was well founded. For nearly 20 years I acted as his medical secretary. His immense collection of papers he has left in my care to be arranged, indexed, and bound. His treatment of some of these cases is curious. He writes in two distinct characters. He describes what he saw and heard as an intelligent layman might, and when in this style of narrative he had seen the patient either through his own hall door to the light of day, or through the gates of darkness to the caverns of the dead, he returns upon the narrative, and in the terms of his art, and with all the force and originality of genius, proceeds to work the analysis, diagnosis, and illustration. He sounds like a really diligent worker. Here and there, a case strikes me as of a kind to amuse or horrify a lay reader with an interest quite different from the peculiar one which it may possess for an expert. With slight modifications, chiefly of language and of course a change of names, I copy the following. The narrator is Dr. Martin Hesselius. I find it among the voluminous notes of cases which he made during a tour in England about 64 years ago. I like that he's changed the name, even before, you know, legal protections of medical records. Gotta respect your patient's privacy. It is related in a series of letters to his friend Professor Van Loo of Leyden. The professor was not a physician, but a chemist, and a man who read history and metaphysics and medicine, and had, in his day, written a play. A real Renaissance man there. The narrative is, therefore, if somewhat less valuable as a medical record, necessarily written in a manner more likely to interest an unlearned reader. These letters, from a memorandum attached, appear to have been returned on the death of the professor in 1918 to Dr. Hesselius. They are written, some in English, some in French, but the greater part in German. I am faithful, though I am conscious, by no means a graceful translator, and although here and there I omit some passages and shorten others and disguise names, I have interpolated nothing. So that's the prologue, and here we are on Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Dr. Hesselius relates how he met the Reverend Mr. Jennings. The Reverend Mr. Jennings is tall and thin. He is middle-aged and dresses with a natty, old-fashioned, high church precision, which I think means he probably looks a little bit uptight. He is naturally a little stately, but not at all stiff. His features, without being handsome, are well formed, and their expression extremely kind, but also shy. I met him one evening at Lady Mary Hayduke's. The modesty and benevolence of his countenance are extremely prepossessing. We were but a small party, and he joined agreeably enough in the conversation. He seems to enjoy listening very much more than contributing to the talk, but what he says is always to the purpose and well said. He is a great favorite of Lady Mary's, who it seems consults him upon many things, and thinks him the most happy and blessed person on earth. Little she knows about him. The Reverend Mr. Jennings is a bachelor, and has, they say, £60,000 in the funds, so he's reasonably well set up for the time. He is a charitable man. He is most anxious to be actively employed in his sacred profession, and yet though always tolerably well elsewhere, when he goes down to his vicarage in Warwickshire to engage in the actual duties of his sacred calling, his health soon fails him, and in a very strange way. So says Lady Mary. I don't know, maybe he just doesn't like his job as much as people think. There is no doubt that Mr. Jennings' health does break down in generally a sudden and mysterious way, sometimes in the very act of officiating in his old and pretty church at Kenlis. It may be his heart, it may be his brain, but so it happened 3 or 4 times or oftener that after proceeding a certain way in the service, he has on a sudden stopped short, and after a silence apparently quite unable to resume, he has fallen into solitary, inaudible prayer, his hands and eyes uplifted, and then pale as death, and in the agitation of a strange shame and horror, descended trembling, and got into the vestry room, leaving his congregation without explanation to themselves. This occurred when his curate was absent. When he goes down to Kenlis now, he always takes care to provide a clergyman to share his duty, and to supply his place on the instant should he become suddenly thus incapacitated. Like, I don't know. If it were me in my job, I feel like if I were constantly breaking down in the middle of doing my job and being unable to proceed, even if I provided my own replacement, I feel like I would lose my job. Like whoever's paying this guy, I think is being very generous in their terms of employment. When Mr. Jennings breaks down quite and beats a retreat from the vicarage and returns to London, where, in a dark street off Piccadilly, he inhabits a very narrow house, Lady Mary says that he is always perfectly well. I have my own opinion about that. There are degrees, of course. We shall see. Mr. Jennings is a perfectly gentlemanlike man. People, however, remark something odd. There is an impression a little ambiguous. One thing which certainly contributes to it, people think I don't remember or perhaps distinctly remark, but I did, almost immediately. Mr. Jennings has a way of looking sidelong upon the carpet, as if his eyes followed the movements of something there. This, of course, is not always. It occurs only now and then. but often enough to give a certain oddity, as I have said, to his manner. And in this glance traveling along the floor there was something both shy and anxious. A medical philosopher, as you are good enough to call me, elaborating theories by the aid of cases sought out by himself, and by him watched and scrutinized with more time at command, and consequently infinitely more minuteness than the ordinary practitioner can afford, falls insensibly into habits of observation, which accompany him everywhere, and are exercised, as some people would say, impertinently, upon every subject that presents itself with the least likelihood of rewarding inquiry. There was a promise of this kind in the slight, timid, kindly, but reserved gentleman who I met for the first time at this agreeable little evening gathering. I observed, of course, more than I here set down, but I reserve all that borders on the technical for a strictly scientific paper. I may remark that when I here speak of medical science, I do so as I hope some day to see it more generally understood, and in a much more comprehensive sense than its generally material treatment warrants. I believe the entire natural world is but the ultimate expression of that spiritual world from which and in which alone it has its life. I believe that the essential man is a spirit, that the spirit is an organized substance, but as different in point of material from what we ordinarily understand by matter, as light or electricity is, that the material body is, in the most literal sense, a vesture, and death consequently no interruption of the living man's existence, but simply his extraction from the natural body, a process which commences the moment of what we term death, and the completion of which, at furthest a few days later, is the resurrection in power. That's quite the little treatise on the meaning of life and humanity there by Dr. Hesselius. The person who weighs the consequences of these positions will probably see their practical bearing upon medical science. No, not really. I don't. Maybe it's because I'm not a doctor. I don't know. This is, however, by no means the proper place for displaying the proofs and discussing the consequences of this too generally unrecognized state of facts. I would absolutely not apply the phrase state of facts to his spiritual beliefs there. In pursuance of my habit, I was covertly observing Mr. Jennings with all my caution, though he fancies himself a Sherlock Holmes, too. I don't know. I don't know. This guy seems like he'd be kind of irritating to be around. Bit of a know-it-all. I think he perceived it. Yeah, because you probably weren't as sneaky as you thought you were being. Don't stare at people at parties. It's weird. Don't be weird. And I saw plainly that he was cautiously observing me. Yeah, see, you get what you give out there, bud. Lady Mary happened to address me by my name as Dr. Hesselius. I saw that he glanced at me more sharply, and then became thoughtful for a few minutes. After this, as I conversed with a gentleman at the other end of the room, I saw him look at me more steadily, and with an interest which I thought I understood. I then saw him take an opportunity of chatting with Lady Mary, and was, as one always is, perfectly aware of being the subject of a distant inquiry and answer. Yeah, they're probably talking smack about you, because you're a weirdo who stares at people at parties. This tall clergyman approached me by and by, and in a little time we had got into conversation. When two people who like reading and know books and places, having traveled, wish to converse, it is very strange if they can't find topics. It was not accident that brought him near me and led him into conversation. He knew German and had read my essays on metaphysical medicine, which suggests more than they actually say. This courteous man, gentle, shy, plainly a man of thought and reading, who moving and talking among us, was not altogether of us, and whom I already suspected of leading a life whose transactions and alarms were carefully concealed, with an impenetrable reserve from, not only the world, but his best beloved friends, was cautiously weighing in his own mind the idea of taking a certain step with regard to me. He's going to tell you all his secrets. Maybe he's a murderer. Maybe he has a sex dungeon. You don't know. I penetrated his thoughts without his being aware of it, and was careful to say nothing which could betray his sensitive vigilance, which could betray to his sensitive vigilance my suspicions respecting his position, or my surmises about his plans respecting myself. We chatted upon indifferent subjects for a time, but at last he said, I was very much interested by some papers of yours, Dr. Hesselius, upon which you term metaphysical medicine. I read them in German 10 or 12 years ago. Have they been translated? No, I'm sure they have not. I should have heard. They would have asked my leave, I think. I asked the publishers here, a few months ago, to get the book for me in the original German, but they tell me it is out of print. So it is, and has been for some years. But it flatters me as an author to find that you have not forgotten my little book. Although, I added, laughing, 10 or 12 years is a considerable time to have managed without it. But I suppose you have been turning the subject over again in your mind, or something has happened lately to revive your interest in it. At this remark, accompanied by a glance of inquiry, a sudden embarrassment disturbed Mr. Jennings, analogous to that which makes a young lady blush and look foolish. Excuse you there, Dr. Hesselius. I'll have you know that I never blush when I look foolish. I just wholeheartedly go right into it. Own your awkward foolishness. He dropped his eyes and folded his hands together uneasily, and looked oddly, and you would have said guiltily, for a second. I helped him out of his awkwardness in the best way, by appearing not to observe it, and going straight on, I said, those revivals of interest in a subject happen to me often. One book suggests another, and then often sends me back a wild goose chase over an interval of 20 years. But if you still care to possess a copy, I shall be only too happy to provide you. I have still got 2 or 3 by me, and if you allow me to present one, I shall be very much honored. You are very good indeed, he said, quite at ease again. In a moment, I almost despaired. I don't know how to thank you. Pray don't say a word. The thing is really so little worth that I am only ashamed of having offered it. And if you thank me any more, I shall throw it into the fire in a fit of modesty. Mr. Jennings laughed. He inquired where I was staying in London, and after a little more conversation on a variety of subjects, he took his departure. So that was a super awkward party exchange, if ever there was one, and it was both of their faults. Don't be weird by staring at people at parties, and don't bring up your weird, mysterious secrets that you may or may not be hiding at a party. You're both going to just wreck the vibe. Stop it. Now we're on to chapter 2. The doctor questions Lady Mary, and she answers. I like your Victor. I like your vicar so much, Lady Mary, said I, so soon as he was gone. He has read, traveled, and thought, and having also suffered, he ought to be an accomplished companion. So he is, and better still, he is really a good man, said she. His advice is invaluable about my schools, and all my little undertakings at Dawlbridge, and he's so painstaking. He takes so much trouble, you have no idea. Wherever he thinks he can be of use, he's so good-natured and so sensible. It is pleasant to hear so good an account of his neighborly virtues. I can only testify to his being an agreeable and gentle companion, and in addition to what you have told me, I think I can tell you 2 or 3 things about him, said I. Really? Yes, to begin with, he's unmarried. Yes, that's right, go on. That's not impressive. You can tell if he's wearing a ring or not. He has been writing, that is, he was, but for 2 or 3 years perhaps he has not gone on with his work, and the book was upon some rather abstract subject, perhaps theology. Well, he was writing a book, as you say. I'm not quite sure what it was about, but only that it was nothing that I cared for. Very likely you were right, and certainly he did stop, yes. And although he only drank a little coffee here tonight, he likes tea, at least did like it, extravagantly. Yes, that's quite true. He drank green tea a good deal, didn't he? I pursued. Well, that's very odd. Green tea was a subject on which we almost came to quarrel. He has quite given that up, said I. So he has. And now one more fact. His mother or his father, did you know them? Yes, both. His father is only 10 years dead, and their place is near Dawlbridge. We knew them very well, she answered. Well, either his mother or his father, I should rather think his father, saw a ghost, said I. Well, you really are a conjurer, Dr. Hesselius. I mean, that's sort of a weird thing to say. Conjurer or no, haven't I said it right? I answered merrily. You certainly have, and it was his father. He was a silent, whimsical man, and he used to bore my father about his dreams, and at last he told him a story about a ghost he had seen and talked with, and a very odd sort of story it was. I remember it particularly because I was so afraid of him. This story was long before he died, when I was quite a child, and his ways were so silent and moping, and he used to drop in sometimes in the dusk when I was alone in the drawing room, and I used to fancy there were ghosts about him. I smiled and nodded. And now, having established my character as a conjurer, I think I must say good night, said I. But how did you find it out? By the planets, of course, as the gypsies do, I answered, and so gaily we said our good nights. Yeah, Dr. Hesselius is weird. Next morning I sent the little book he had been inquiring after, and a note to Mr. Jennings, and on returning late that evening I found that he had called at my lodgings and left his card. He asked whether I was at home, and asked at what hour he would be most likely to find me. Does he intend opening his case and consulting me professionally, as they say? I hope so. I have already conceived a theory about him. It is supported by Lady Mary's answers to my parting questions. I should like much to ascertain from his own lips. But what can I do consistently with good breeding to invite a confession? Nothing. I rather think he meditates one. At all events, my dear Van L., I shan't make myself difficult of access. I mean to return his visit tomorrow. It will be only civil in return for his politeness to ask to see him. Perhaps something may come of it. Whether much or little or nothing, my dear Van L., you shall hear. Pardon me. Don't swallow and inhale at the same time. This guy's sort of, as a doctor though, I kind of think this guy's behavior is slightly inappropriate. Like, if your family doctor you met at a party and they were asking all these weird questions and wanting to know if your parents could see ghosts, you would have follow-up questions. Pardon me. So here we go, chapter 3. Dr. Hesselius picks up something in Latin books. Well, I have called at Blank Street. On inquiring at the door, the servant told me that Mr. Jennings was engaged very particularly with a gentleman, a clergyman from Kenlis, his parish in the country. Intending to reserve my privilege and to call again, I merely intimated that I should try another time, and had turned to go, when the servant begged my pardon, and asked me, looking at me a little more attentively than well-bred persons of his order usually do, whether I was Dr. Hesselius. And on learning that I was, he said, perhaps then, sir, he would allow me to mention it to Mr. Jennings, for I am sure he wishes to see you. The servant returned in a moment with a message from Mr. Jennings, asking me to go into his study, which was in effect his back drawing-room, promising to be with me in very few minutes. This was really a study, almost a library. The room was lofty, with 2 tall, slender windows and rich, dark curtains. It was much larger than I had expected, and stored with books on every side, from floor to the ceiling. It sounds great. The upper carpet, for to my tread it felt like there were 2 or 3, was a Turkey carpet. I'm assuming he means a Turkish carpet, not like a carpet from Turkey, not a carpet depicting or made out of turkeys. Although, I suppose that's possible. That'd be kind of funny, actually. A fancy, expensive Turkish rug just about turkeys. You'd buy it. Don't pretend you wouldn't. My steps fell noiselessly. The bookcases standing out placed the windows, particularly narrow ones, in deep recess. The effect of the room was, although extremely comfortable and even luxurious, decidedly gloomy, and aided by the silence, almost oppressive. I maintain that this room is great, and I want one. Perhaps, however, I ought to have allowed something for association. My mind had connected peculiar ideas with Mr. Jennings. I stepped into this perfectly silent room of a very silent house with a peculiar foreboding, and its darkness and solemn clothing of books, for except where two narrow looking-glasses were set in the wall, they were everywhere, helped this somber feeling. While awaiting Mr. Jennings' arrival, I amused myself by looking into some of the books with which his shelves were laden. Not among these, but immediately under them, with their backs upward on the floor, I lighted upon a complete set of Swedenborg's Arcana Celestia, in the original Latin, a very fine folio set, bound in the natty livery which theology affects, pure vellum, namely gold letters and carmine edges. They sound really pretty, actually. There were paper markers in several of these volumes. I raised and placed them, one after the other, upon the table, and opening where these papers were placed, I read in the solemn Latin phraseology a series of sentences indicated by a pencil line in the margin. Of these, I copy a few here, translating them into English. So he's just going to go through this guy's personal stuff. I maintain, although he might be well respected in his profession, this is not appropriate professional doctor behavior. When man's interior sight is opened, which is that of his spirit, then there appears the things of another life, which cannot possibly be made visible to the bodily sight. By the internal sight, it has been granted me to see the things that are of the other life more clearly than I see those that are in the world. From these considerations, it is evident that external vision exists from interior vision, and this from a vision still more interior, and so on. There are with every man at least two evil spirits. With wicked genii, there is also a fluent speech, but harsh and grating. There is also among them a speech which is not fluent, wherein the dissident of the thoughts is perceived as something secretly creeping along with it. The evil spirits associated with man are, indeed, from the hells. But when with man, they are not then in hell, but are taken out thence. The place where they then are is in the midst between heaven and hell, and is called the world of spirits. When the evil spirits who are with man are in that world, they are not in any infernal torment, but in every thought and affection of the man, and so on, in all that the man himself enjoys. But when they are remitted into their hell, they return to their former state. If evil spirits could perceive that they were associated with man, and yet that they were spirits separate from him, and if they could flow into the things of his body, they would attempt by 1,000 means to destroy him, for they hate man with a deadly hatred. Knowing, therefore, that I was a man in the body, they were continually striving to destroy me, not as to the body only, but especially as to the soul, for to destroy any man or spirit is the very delight of life of all those who are in hell, but I have been continually protected by the Lord. Hence it appears how dangerous it is for a man to be in a living consort with spirits unless he be in the good of faith, rather. Nothing is more carefully guarded from the knowledge of associate spirits than their being thus conjoint with a man. For if they knew it, they would speak to him with the intention to destroy him. The delight of hell is to do evil to man and to hasten his eternal ruin. A long note, written with a very sharp and fine pencil in Mr. Jennings' neat hand at the very foot of the page, caught my eye. Expecting his criticism upon the text, I read a word or two and stopped, for it was something quite different, and began with these words: Deus miseritor me, my. That's my terrible Latin for today. My apologies. May God compassionate me. Thus warned of its private nature, I averted my eyes and shut the book, replacing all the volumes as I had found them, except one which interested me, and in which, as men studious and solitary in their habits will do, I grew so absorbed as to take no cognizance of the outer world, nor to remember where I was. Yeah, you better put back all the man's personal private property that you just spent a lot of time rummaging through and reading all his private notes. I was reading some pages which refer to representatives and correspondence in the technical language of Swedenborg, and had arrived at a passage, the substance of which is that evil spirits, when seen by other eyes than those of their infernal associates, present themselves by correspondence, in the shape of the beast, Fera, which represents their particular lust and life, in aspect and in aspect direful and atrocious. This is a long passage and particular excuse me. This is a long passage and particularizes a number of those bestial forms. I need cat hair on my face. All right, here we are in chapter 4. Four eyes were reading the passage. I was running the head of my pencil case along the line as I read it, and something caused me to raise my eyes. Directly before me was one of the mirrors I have mentioned, in which I saw reflected the tall shape of my friend Mr. Jennings leaning over my shoulder, and reading the page at which I was busy, and with a face so dark and wild that I should have scarcely known him. I turned and rose. He stood erect also, and with an effort laughed a little, saying, "I came in and asked you how you did, but without succeeded." Pardon me, let me try that again. I came in and asked you how you did, but without succeeding in awakening you from your book. So I could not restrain my curiosity, and very impertinently, I'm afraid, peeped over your shoulder. This is not your first time of looking into those pages. You have looked into Swedenborg, no doubt, a long time ago. I don't think you need to apologize. It's your house. It's your library. They're your book. They're your notes. Hesselius is the one in the wrong here. It's your stuff, dude. Oh dear, yes, I owe Swedenborg a great deal. You will discover traces of him in the little book on metaphysical medicine, which you were so good as to remember. Although my friend affected a gaiety of manner, there was a slight flush in his face, and I could perceive that he was inwardly much perturbed. I'm scarcely yet qualified. I know so little of Swedenborg. I've only had them a fortnight, he answered, and I think they are rather likely to make a solitary man nervous. That is, judging from the very little I have read. I don't say that they have made me so, he laughed, and I'm so very much obliged for the book. I hope you got my note. Yeah, so you're going to just pretend that reading creepy books about demons hanging around man in infernal feral forms don't make you nervous, Mr. Jennings? I don't think that's true. I made all proper acknowledgments and modest disclaimers. I never read a book that I go with so entirely as that of yours, he continued. I saw at once there is more in it than is I saw at once there is more in it than is quite unfolded. Do you know Dr. Harley? He asked, rather abruptly. In passing, the editor remarks that the physician here named was one of the most eminent who had ever practiced in England. I did, having had letters to him, and had experienced from him great courtesy and considerable assistance during my visit to England. I think that man one of the very greatest fools I ever met in my life, said Mr. Jennings. He's got some strong feelings about apparently an extremely competent doctor. This was the first time I had ever heard him say a sharp thing of anybody, and such a term applied to so high a name a little startled me. Really, and in what way? I asked. In his profession, he answered. I smiled. I mean this, he said. He seems to me one half blind. I mean one half of all he looks at is dark. Preternaturally bright and vivid and all the rest. And the worst of it, it seems willful. I can't get him. I mean he won't. I've had some experience of him as a physician. But I look on him, in that sense, no better than a paralytic mind, an intellect half dead. I'll tell you, I know I shall sometime, all about it, he said with a little agitation. You stay some months longer in England. If I should be out of town during your stay for a little time, will you allow me to trouble you with a letter? So he doesn't think that this other doctor is any good. He thinks he's ignorant. Sure, Reverend Jennings. I'm sure the books that you've been reading are way better than an eminent physician's years of medical school and practice. That probably doesn't mean anything. Maybe the Reverend Jennings gets his medical information from Karen on Facebook. I should be only too happy, I assured him. Very good of you. I am so utterly dissatisfied with Harley. Yeah, he's probably one of the lizard people or something. A little leaning to the materialistic school, I said. A mere materialist, he corrected me. You can't think how that sort of thing worries me. Worries one who knows better. Oh yeah, you totally know better than the doctor, bud. You won't tell anyone, any of my friends that I am hippish now, for instance. No one knows, not even Lady Mary, that I have seen Dr. Harley or any other doctor. So pray don't mention it. And if I should have any threatening of an attack, you'll kindly let me write. Or should I be in town, have a little talk with you. Yeah, you don't want people to know that you're seeing a preeminent doctor about important medical knowledge. Can't have your friends knowing about that, I guess. I was full of conjecture, and unconsciously I found I had fixed my eyes gravely on him, for he lowered his for a moment, and he said, I see you think I might as well tell you now. I mean, you really might as well. You've kind of made yourself look like a real ass here. Or else you are forming a conjecture. But you may as well give it up. If you are guessing all the rest of your life, you will never hit on it. He shook his head, smiling, and over that wintry sunshine a black cloud suddenly came down, and he drew his breath in, through his teeth as men do in pain. Sorry, of course, to learn that you apprehend occasion to consult any of us, but command me when and how you like, and I need not assure you that your confidence is sacred. He then talked of quite other things, and in a comparatively cheerful way, and after a little time I took my leave. And we have chapter 5. Dr. Hesselius is summoned to Richmond. Presumably the Reverend Jennings has now got his head out of his ass and is actually going to talk about what's wrong with him. We parted cheerfully, but he was not cheerful, nor was I. There are certain expressions of that powerful organ of spirit, the human face, which although I have seen them often and possess a doctor's nerve, yet disturb me profoundly. One look of Mr. Jennings haunted me. It had seized my imagination with so dismal a power that I changed my plans for the evening and went to the opera, feeling that I wanted a change of ideas. I wish I could just go to the opera whenever I needed a change of ideas. That sounds expensive. I heard nothing of or from him for 2 or 3 days, when a note in his hand reached me. It was cheerful and full of hope. He said that he had been for some little time so much better, quite well, in fact, that he was going to make a little experiment, and run down for a month or so to his parish, to try whether a little work might not quite set him up. There was in it a fervent religious expression of gratitude for his restoration, as he now almost hoped he might call it. A day or two later I saw Lady Mary, who repeated what his note had announced, and told me that he was actually in Warwickshire, having resumed his clerical duties at Kenlis, and she added, I begin to think that he is really perfectly well, and that there was never anything the matter more than nerves and fancy. We are all nervous, but I fancy there is nothing like a little hard work for that kind of weakness, and he has made up his mind to try it. I should not be surprised if he did not come back for a year. So that might seem a little bit judgy on her part, because not all illnesses are visible, but I kind of see where she's coming from, because if you're super sick and you're not going to talk to any about it, and you're hiding the fact that you're seeing a doctor, like, yeah, people are probably not going to think that there's a legitimate problem. Notwithstanding all this confidence, only 2 days later I had this note dated from his house off Piccadilly. Dear sir, I have returned disappointed. If I should feel at all able to see you, I shall write to you. I shall write to ask you kindly to call. At present I am too low, and in fact simply unable to say all I wish to say. Pray don't mention my name to my friends. I can see no one. By and by, please God, you shall hear from me. I mean to take a run into Shropshire, where some of my people are. God bless you. May we, on my return, meet more happily than I can now write. He's very secretive about all of this. Don't tell anyone. Don't say anything. Don't tell anyone I'm seeing you professionally. No wonder Mary just thinks he's a weird, nervous, neurotic wreck. About a week after this, I saw Lady Mary at her own house, the last person, she said, left in town, and just on the wing for Brighton, for the London season was quite over. She told me that she had heard from Mr. Jennings' niece, Martha, in Shropshire. There was nothing to be gathered from her letter, more than that he was low and nervous. In those words, of which healthy people think so lightly, what a world of suffering is sometimes hidden. I will agree with him there. You can't always tell when something's up with someone, especially if it's mental. Nearly 5 weeks passed without any further news of Mr. Jennings. At the end of that time I received a note from him. He wrote, I have been in the country and have had a change of air, change of scene, change of faces, change of everything and every change of everything and in everything but myself. I have made up my mind, so far as the most resolute creature on earth can do it, to tell my case fully to you. It is about bloody time, dude. If your engagements will permit, pray come to me today, tomorrow, or the next day, but pray defer as little as possible. You know not how much I need help. I have a quiet house at Richmond where I now am. Perhaps you can manage to come to dinner, or to luncheon, or even to tea. You shall have no trouble in finding me out. The servant at Street, who takes this note, will have a carriage at your door at any hour you please, and I am always to be found. You will say that I ought not to be alone. I have tried everything. Come and see. How does this man still have his job? I called up the servant and decided on going out the same evening, which accordingly I did. He would have been much better in a lodging-house or hotel, I thought, as I drove up through a small short row of sombre elms to a very old-fashioned brick house, darkened by the foliage of these trees, which overtopped and nearly surrounded it. It was a perverse choice, for nothing could be imagined more triste and silent. He's sick. He's doing the best he can. Leave him alone. The house, I found, belonged to him. He had stayed for a day or two in town, and finding it for some cause insupportable, had come out here, probably because, being furnished and his own, he was relieved of the thought of delay, or at the thought and delay of selection by coming here. Yeah, it was just the easiest thing to do at the time. Don't be so judgy. The sun had already set, and the red reflected light of the western sky illuminated the scene with the peculiar effect with which we are all familiar. The hall seemed very dark, but getting to the back drawing-room, whose windows command the west, I was again in the same dusky light. I sat down, looking out upon the richly wooded landscape that glowed in the grand and melancholy light which was every moment fading. The corners of the room were already dark. All was growing dim, and the gloom was insensibly toning my mind, already prepared for what was sinister. I was waiting alone for his arrival, which soon took place. The door communicating with the front room opened, and the tall figure of Mr. Jennings, faintly seen in the ruddy twilight, came, with quiet, stealthy steps, into the room. We shook hands, and taking a chair to the window, for there was still light enough to enable us to see each other's faces, you could probably also just light a lamp, just saying. He sat down beside me, and placing his hand upon my arm, with scarcely a word of preface, began his narrative. Finally! If you'd stopped dicking around so much, maybe you wouldn't have gotten to this sorry state, Mr. Jennings. So, Chapter 6. How Mr. Jennings Met His Companion. The faint glow of the west, the pomp of the then lonely woods of Richmond, were before us. Behind and about us the darkening room, and on the stony face or the sufferer, for the character of his face, though still gentle and sweet, was changed, rested that dim, odd glow which seems to descend and produce, where it touches, lights, sudden though faint, which are lost, and almost without gradation, in darkness. The silence, too, was utter, not a distant wheel or bark or whistle from without, and within the depressing stillness of an invalid bachelor's house. I guessed well the nature, though not even vaguely the particulars of the revelations I was about to receive, from that fixed face of suffering that so oddly flushed stood out, like a portrait of Schleken's before its background of darkness. It began, he said, on the 15th of October, 3 years and 11 weeks ago and 2 days. I keep very accurate count. Yeah, that is strangely accurate. For every day is torment. If I leave anywhere a chasm in my narrative, please tell me. So this guy's gone, whatever's up with him, he's lived with it for 3 years. That's what I'm saying. If you pulled your head out of your butt, you maybe could have had this dealt with like a long time ago. About 4 years ago, I began a work which has cost me very much thought and reading. It was upon the religious metaphysics of the ancients. I know, said I, the actual religion of educated and thinking paganism, quite apart from symbolic worship, a wide and very interesting field. Yes, but not good for the mind, the Christian mind, I mean. Paganism is all bound together in essential unity and with evil sympathy. I resent that remark. Most people, if you're into the devil and stuff, you're actually probably not pagan. Their religion involves their art and both their manners, and the subject is a degrading fascination, and the nemesis, sure. God forgive me. Look, just because you don't get it doesn't mean it's evil. I wrote a great deal. I wrote late at night. I was always thinking on the subject, walking about, wherever I was, everywhere. It thoroughly infected me. You are to remember that all the material ideas connected with it were more or less of the beautiful, the subject itself delightfully interesting, and I, then, without a care. He sighed heavily. I believe that everyone who sets about writing in earnest does his work, as a friend of mine phrased it, on something, tea or coffee or tobacco. I suppose there is a material waste that must be hourly supplied in such occupations, or that we should grow too abstracted and the mind, as it were, pass out of the body, unless it were reminded often of the connection by actual sensation. At all events, I felt the want and supplied it. Tea was my companion. At first, the ordinary black tea, made in the usual way. What would be the unusual way to make it? You're just going to chew on the leaves or something? Not too strong, but I drank a good deal and increased its strength as I went on. I never experienced an uncomfortable symptom from it. I began to take a little green tea. I found the effect pleasanter. It cleared and intensified the power of thought. I had come to take it frequently, but not stronger than one might take it for pleasure, as opposed to taking it for punishment. I wrote a great deal out here. It was so quiet, and in this room. I used to sit up very late, and it became a habit with me to sip my tea, green tea, every now and then as my work proceeded. I had a little kettle on my table that swung over a lamp, and made tea 2 or 3 times between 11 o'clock and 2 or 3 in the morning, my hours of going to bed. That is a lie. You drank all those cups of tea, you aren't sleeping. You are spending your whole night and early morning teaing. We all know that that's what was actually happening. I used to go into town every day. I was not a monk, and although I spent an hour or two in a library, hunting up authorities and looking out lights upon my theme, I was in no morbid state, as far as I can judge. I met my friends pretty much as usual and enjoyed their society, and on the whole, existence had never been, I think, so pleasant before. Oh, don't worry, I'm sure we'll get to the part where you're going to blame all us pagans for all your problems. I had met I had met with a man who had some odd old books, German editions in medieval Latin, and I was only too happy to be permitted to access them. This obliging person's books were in the city, a very out of the way part of it. I had rather outstayed my intended hour, and on coming out, seeing no cab near, I was tempted to get into the omnibus, which used to drive past this house. It was darker than this by the time the bus had reached an old house. You might have remarked the door, and there the last passenger but myself got out. We drove along rather faster. It was twilight now. I leaned back in my corner next the door, ruminating pleasantly. The interior of the omnibus was nearly dark. I had observed in the corner opposite to me, at the other side, and at the end next to the horses, two small circular reflections. as it seemed to me, of reddish light. They were about 2 inches apart, and about the size of those small brass buttons that yachting men used to put upon their jackets. That's like a really specific comparison. I began to speculate, as listless men will, upon this trifle, as it seemed. From what center did that faint but deep red light come, and from what? Glass beads, buttons, toy decorations? Was it reflected? We were lumbering along gently, having nearly a mile still to go. I had not solved the puzzle, and it became in another minute more odd, for those two luminous points, with a sudden jerk, descended nearer the floor, keeping still their relative distance and horizontal position, and then, as suddenly, they rose to the level of the seat on which I was sitting, and I saw them no more. My curiosity was now really excited, and before I had time to think, I saw again these two dull lamps, again together near the floor, again they disappeared, and again in their old corner I saw them. So keeping my eyes upon them, I edged quietly up my own side towards the end at which I still saw these tiny discs of red. There was very little light in the bus. It was nearly dark. I leaned forward to aid my endeavor to discover what these little circles really were. They shifted their position a little as I did so. I began now to perceive the outline of something black, and I soon saw with tolerable distinctness the outline of a small black monkey, pushing its face toward, pushing its face forward in mimicry to meet mine. Those were its eyes, and I now dimly saw its teeth grinning at me. I drew back, not knowing whether it might not meditate a spring. Yeah, that's the thing that happens. Monkeys and apes and stuff will go after people. I fancied that one of the passengers had forgot this ugly pet, and wishing to ascertain something of its temper, though not caring to trust my fingers to it, that's a good call, I poked my umbrella softly towards it. The oldest of all the scientific methods. If you don't want to actually touch it, but you're still curious, poke it with a stick. It remained immovable. Up to it, through it, and back and forward it passed without the slightest resistance. I can't in the least convey to you the kind of horror that I felt when I had ascertained that the thing was an illusion, as I then supposed. There came a misgiving about myself and a terror that fascinated me in impotence to remove my gaze from the eyes of the brute for some minutes. As I looked, it made a little skip back, quite into the corner, and I, in a panic, found myself at the door, having put my head out, drawing deep breaths of outer air, and staring at the lights and trees we were passing, too glad to reassure myself of reality. I stopped the bus and got out. I perceived the man I perceived the man look oddly I perceived rather, my apologies there. I perceived the man looked oddly at me as I paid him. I dare say there was something unusual in my looks and manner. I had never felt so strangely before, because you're being pursued by a ghost monkey and you just hit it with a stick. If you're being chased, word of advice here, you're being chased by a weird ghost monkey with bright red evilly eyes, probably don't hit it with a stick. I feel like that's just going to agitate it. Now, that is the end of chapter 6, and that is where I'm going to leave it for today, because this video is already on the longer side. I will pick this up at a later point to read to you the conclusion of Green Tea by Sheridan Le Fanu, and we will find out the true nature of the weird, possibly demonic ghost monkey, and how much he's going to blame on ancient pagan evilness as opposed to his own shortcomings, which is the real horror of the Victorian era. Not our fault. We're clever Victorian white men. Therefore, everything else is the problem. So enjoy the rest of your day, your evening, whatever time it is that you are watching this. Thank you so much for being with me and listening to me read this story. Bye, everyone.